You are listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Chris, and in this episode, I'm joined by rare but dear guest Adam from New York, as well as my regular co-hosts Mathieu and Saul, to talk about three of the biggest films in not just Western history, but film history. A Fistful of Dollars, For a Few Dollars More, and of course, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, often called the Dollar Trilogy or the Man with No Name Trilogy. Each of them stand in the pantheon of great cinema, each of them directed by Sergio Leone, each of them starring Clint Eastwood, and each of them scored by Ennio Morricone. These are also the three films that literally put spaghetti westerns on the map and in many ways invented their own aesthetics. They broke all the rules of the Hollywood Western, including some of the oddest ones you can imagine, such as the murderer and the victim not being seen in the same shot when the bullets start flying. The way the world saw these films were in so many ways revolutionary. And that's not to talk about the long takes, the wide angles, the incredible orchestral music. And that music is probably etched into all of our minds. They come to define what Westerns are to so many people. And we also have to talk about the tension these very simple tools created, especially in the stand-ups. These three films essentially made what had been a small batch of very low-budget pulpy films into a phenomena of, granted, if you look at most spaghetti westerns, still a large batch of pretty low-budget pulpy films, but films a lot of people were seeing. But these three films are not any other spaghetti westerns. They are, in almost all contexts, considered the best, and the production values are there to prove it. For this episode, we'll talk through each of the films, one by one, including the many ways they subverted expectations and changed what Westerns could be. So let's just start with a really simple opening question. What is it that makes these three films so special to you?
Hi, this is Adam from New York. To me, what stands out about these movies, well, there are many things that stand out, and you already highlighted some of them, the wide-angle shots, for example, but what stands out to me most thematically is the amorality of the heroes and protagonists. And whether it's Lee Van Cleef in one movie, or Eli Wallach in another, or Clint Eastwood in all three, these are not traditional Western heroes. And when we last talked about Westerns, in one of our earlier podcasts, we talked about The Great Silence, which is another great spaghetti Western. And I mentioned that the traditional Western proposes a sort of central mythological narrative. And that mythological narrative is about the civilizing of the West and the passage of pioneers and ranchers and gunmen through the West as a civilizing and beneficial force. And the gunman in that mythical narrative is always a hero of frontier justice. They provide justice where justice does not already exist. In the spaghetti Westerns, and I think this is very much due to the case that they are Italian productions, or in some cases, Italian-Spanish productions, they're not really captive to this whole sort of American mythology. They feel free to do what they want. So they don't feel like they have to uphold a certain American narrative. And as a result, we get these much more intriguing protagonists who don't care, or not that they don't care, but they're not primarily concerned with justice and with fairness and with protecting civilization. They're ultimately in it for themselves. They are driven by self-interest. And if they at some point do the right thing, it's either something that's secondary to their profit motive or tangential to their profit motive. And as a result, we get heroes that are anti-heroes. They're protagonists, they're the most positive characters in the story, but they don't have typical traits of heroic characters, honesty and courage and selflessness. And as a result, that's how we end up with this sort of iconic figure who's been called the man with no name, although I think that's really more marketing than anything. In each of the three movies, he goes by name. perhaps a nickname, but he's become the man with no name, and he's become this very sort of iconic and intriguing figure of the West. So that's what stands out the most to me.
Hi, this is Mathieu from France, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly in particular is a film I saw first when I was maybe 13 or 14, and it completely blew me away. It has stayed a favorite since then when I rewatched it. And it's weird because to me, that film kind of represented what a Western was for me, because I didn't watch many movies growing up, and not particularly Westerns. I think I saw a few others, but anyway, that was a Western to me. And I discovered when I became a cinephile that really it's not, that the Dollar Trilogy is really a special thing. Even taking aside the spaghetti Western categorization, all the other spaghetti Westerns I've seen, like including, you mentioned, Adam, The Great Silence, they don't feel exactly the same as Sergio Leone's films do. They don't quite have that operatic aura to them, right? That epicness, which is, of course, also a result of the score, but of Sergio Leone's direction as well. That being said, I do remember, as you mentioned, in a much more detailed manner, that when I watched it, I was also very impressed that the good guy of the title was really not that good. He wasn't necessarily that bad, but, he was clearly, as you said, in it for himself. And I do remember liking that a lot. So yeah, it's a very special film to me. And I like the other two as well a lot, because I generally really enjoy Sergio Leone's style in terms of Westerns. But yeah, it's especially The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which is for me a special film that I hold dear to my heart.
Hi, it's Sol from Australia. I think going back to Chris's original question, it was what stands out most to us about the trilogy. And I have to say the Morricone scores would be the number one thing that stands out for me the most. That's what I think about first when I think about those films. However, what my co-hosts have said is very accurate. They both talked about the characters being in it for themselves. And in terms of how I see the films thematically, they're all about greed. So it's about greed in the times of the Old West rather than, the traditional heroism of the Old West, which is all quite interesting because it wasn't actually the American West. It's just, European landscapes. I don't know if I necessarily agree that they're the pinnacle of spaghetti Western making. I'd say films like The Great Silence and Once Upon a Time in the West would be possibly superior spaghetti Westerns, but they are definitely very high up there. And it's easy to see why they've got so many fans over the years. It was interesting to hear Matthew talk about the fact that he grew up with The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and he saw it when he was 13 or 14, because I only saw The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly for the first time last year when I was 33. So, yeah, I mean, if we want to get into it later on, but there's a whole lot of reasons behind it, or I can talk about it now if you guys want. But,
sure, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I mean, if it's interesting.
Go ahead. Yeah, okay.
Go ahead, yes.
Okay. So I saw Yojimbo and followed by A Fistful of Dollars really early on to my cinematic journey. I would have probably been maybe 15 or 16 when I saw those two films. For whatever reason, I didn't see the rest of the Dollars trilogy then. And then I spent, I guess, the better part of 10 years going, I don't know if I want to see for a few dollars more and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly without re-watching A Fistful of Dollars. And then I was telling myself, I don't really want to see A Fistful of Dollars again before I've watched Yojimbo again. So, I just kept adding up. And then, just for finally in happenstance, just serendipitously, last year we had a Western challenge and a Japanese challenge, or not Japanese, no. There were two challenges going on the forum at the same time, which allowed me to watch Yojimbo and Fistful of Dollars in the same month. And once I'd got those two watches out of the way, I knew that I was ready to go and finally see the other two films in the trilogy. And we'll talk a bit more about For a Few Dollars More later on. Yeah, I don't know. We'll talk about that later. but definitely The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I'm so this is such an amazing film. I can't believe I went for so long without actually seeing it, especially considering how influential it was. So yeah, that one was not a disappointment at all.
Can I ask you, Saul, about the difference between seeing Fistful of Dollars for the first time as a teenager and then seeing the others for the first time in your 30s?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure what the what the differences were with it. Films. I guess I've had a lot more films under my belt, and I have also watched a lot more spaghetti westerns before seeing those two films. That probably tampered with my expectations. I did have a very positive experience with A Fistful of Dollars when I rewatched it after rewatching Yojimbo. For a few dollars more was a disappointment. I guess because I'd seen, so many films over the years and it had been heralded as this, ultimate classic, which it wasn't for me. But yeah, no, the good, the bad, and the ugly felt, very fresh to me. Felt like it was really intense experience. And it felt, yeah, just like a young film, like going to watch it. But yeah, unfortunately, I guess I felt a little bit jaded when it came to it for a few dollars more.
Yes, it's incredible that you put yourself in that kind of prison, especially considering that the films aren't direct sequels either and don't necessarily have anything to do with Yojimbo anymore. Though I suppose there is a bit of a legacy, and I love how the ICM forum challenges are kind of informing your watch habits too, because right now, as you're recording, the Western Challenge is going on. The Japanese Challenge is also going on alongside each other, perhaps again, second year in a row. And I'm doing the same combo that you did, with rewatching Fistful of Dollars and Yojimbo, more or less back to back, but the other way around. So that was definitely interesting to see just how similar those films are and how different they are as well. For me, going back to my opening question, I think these films would not be what they are without a score by Ennio Morricone. I don't think that would be possible. And he scored so many spaghetti westerns. Like some of them really have incredible scores as well. I mean, his work is really top range. But I mean, the kind of musical cues he created here, and we must also remember that the scores were often, or I think in all cases, even done before shooting started, so that Leone would use the score on set to kind of know the mood he was going for. I think that part of the filmmaking is probably a little bit unique to it, and the fact that it just, like one of you mentioned earlier, it does have this incredible orchestral feeling, and when you take this orchestral energy and they put it in with these, both long takes and wide takes of people doing very little, simply standing around, and then these close-ups of eyes and guns and boots. You really create something extremely tense. And rewatching these three films over the last week really made me realize how much the music elevated it and how much they changed it, because like my memory of these films is that they're just these gorgeous epic films, and largely they are, but there's many shots in there that are just proficient and they just get the job done. But because of this score is there, everything essentially feels incredible. So the music is the one thing that really grounds it and makes it feel epic. Beyond that, so to try to say something that none of you said, and it's a minor part, but the facial expressions, actually, especially those of Clint Eastwood, it's one of the main consistent things in all three films, with these three different characters just watching what happens around them, reacting to it, and you get these little clues from the way his eyes are twitching that tell you so much, and they have these humorous undertones as well. I mean, they're carried on from Yojimbo, actually. Toshiro Mifune did some of the exact same looks in that film, so it's nice to see that kind of small point of legacy and continuity go through all of the films. But yeah, the facial expressions in close-ups especially is an incredible addition to these films, and one thing that doesn't get discussed enough.
And it's true that we cannot undersell how important the Morricone music is. But as you mentioned, he made music for other spaghetti westerns. And my point is not that the Dollar Trilogy is necessarily better. I mean, I do like it better than other spaghetti westerns, but it's just different. And I think, again, not to go back to it, it's that operatic quality, and it's obviously the Morricone music is part of it, but Leone really brings something there. As you mentioned, these larger-than-life characters, as you mentioned, it's just shots of them just standing in the sun, and he makes that like they're gods, like they're demigods. It's mythological. And that is something that there are some kind pseudo mythological elements in classic westerns, but I think really that's what Leone really brought. That was really special to his films, and not just those three. Also, obviously, Once Upon a Time in the West. But I guess we're not talking about that one today.
I think you're completely right, Mathieu, and I think this larger-than-life quality that Leone put in all of his key films is what makes them feel so epic, makes them stand up. They feel so large. Even something like A Fistful of Dollars, which is just contained to essentially one single town. Most of the action takes place on that street or in the houses around it, and it still feels so large. I mean, that you're completely right. That is in large part not just the score, but the filmmaking. And obviously, none of the other filmmakers working with spaghetti western at the time managed to create that kind of feeling. Some managed to create different feelings. I think Sergio Corbucci is, though not as incredible as Leone, someone who's able to certainly make films up to that standard, especially, and anyone listening should go back to see our classic westerns versus spaghetti western episode where we compare Shane and The Great Silence. Like he could bring incredible attention to this work and do it in a different way than Leone did, and that film just feels so different from this trilogy that they almost deserve a comparison episode in their own. But just the way and the mastery and just the degree of scope that Leone puts into the films is undoubtedly a large part of what makes these three films, as well as Once Upon a Time in the West and his other films, stand out the way they do.
I agree with Mathieu and Chris in that Leone's main stylistic breakthrough is the focus on close-ups. Not just close-ups, but sort of extreme close-ups. They're a few inches closer than we're used to in most movies. And then the contrast between close-ups and panoramic shots. We see so many shots where there's a close-up of a face, or perhaps a hand on a gun, with a very widescreen panoramic shot of a landscape behind them. And the result we get from this is drama and tension. But why is it dramatic and why is it tense? I think because Leone became a very patient filmmaker. And one of the things that I find most interesting about seeing these three movies together, or if you want to add to it, adding Once Upon a Time in the West and seeing those four together, is the development of Leone in terms of his use of time and patience. The first movie, Fistful of Dollars, is 1 hour and 40 minutes. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is 3 hours. Once Upon a Time in the West, I think, is a little longer. His scenes become longer and longer and longer, but they don't really lose anything. I think, in fact, they gain something by being longer. And the great example of this is the first scene from Once Upon a Time in the West, which is basically 10 minutes of three men waiting at a train station, but it's incredibly tense because he's able to use these shots, these close-ups, these panoramic shots, and to add in the Morricone score, and we get that sort of operatic feeling that both of you were referring to before.
Yeah, and those extreme close-ups on eyes, they've become synonymous with westerns, like to the point that it's hard to use them in a different context, or at least without evoking the idea of the duel, right, of the two people in opposition and looking at each other. It's really a signature thing, and generally those films have kind of replaced, I think, for a lot of people, the classic westerns in what we think of as westerns. I think if you ask most people who aren't particularly cinephiles, who aren't particularly knowledgeable about film, to describe to you a western, they'll describe to you a Sergio Leone western. They are not going to describe John Ford western. Maybe they'll mention John Wayne, but the stylistic elements they'll mention will often be things you find more in Sergio Leone westerns than in classic westerns.
I think you're completely right about that, Mathieu. And I think that even when people are making parodies of westerns, what is it they do? They show boots on the ground and close-ups of eyes and close-ups of guns and add on heavy music. So these films really have taken over popular culture and what people think westerns should be. So let's look at the first of these films then, A Fistful of Dollars, which, like we discussed, is probably the simplest. It takes place in the least diverse setting, almost entirely in a town, and it's of course a remake. I'm not sure if it's officially credited as such, but if you compare
Definitely
it with...
not. Definitely not. He was sued. Leone was sued.
And like I said, I'm not sure if they actually officially recognize that at this point.
Oh, yeah, probably, yeah. Maybe now, yeah.
Maybe now, yes. Like if you go to websites, usually today, it's... But yes, it was a ripoff at the time, and Toho Studios did sue Leone. They did win, so I guess if you want to look at it that way, it is official. It is official that it is indeed a remake. And like rewatching them this week as well. I mean, there's even the same jokes. Like in both films, he goes in, and the crew of one of the gangs insult him and bully him, and he comes back later and he kills them. And when he does that, he tells the coffin maker, prepare X set of coffins, and he kills one more person than expected. In Yojimbo, he says, prepare 2 coffins. Oh, never mind, 3. And in A Fistful of Dollars, he says, prepare 3 coffins. He comes back and he says, my mistake, 4. So Leone and Eastwood literally just one-upping Yojimbo as well with the one exact number. But just to look at the film itself, what are your key feelings and impressions of A Fistful of Dollars?
Well, right from the beginning, we see that our ostensible hero is motivated by money. And yes, though it's a ripoff of Yojimbo, A Fistful of Dollars is very much what is traditionally known as a town western. This is a classic trope in westerns in which there is a town where criminal elements are ruling the streets, and a gunman hero comes to clean it up. We've seen dozens and dozens of traditional westerns that follow that plot, often with a very famous lawman, a Wyatt Earp or a Wild Bill Hickok or someone of that type. Well, here we have a gunman who comes to clean up the town, but he's not doing it for any moral reason. He's doing it for his own profit. And there is a scene really early in the movie which really piqued my ear. Eastwood is talking to the bar manager, and he's hearing what setup is in the town, and the bar manager, I think his name is Silvanito, says to him that the Baxters and the Rojos are selling guns and liquor to Indians. And it reminded me very briefly of an old John Ford Western called My Darling Clementine. And the reason it reminded me of that is there's a scene in that movie where Henry Fonda, who is a lawman who comes to clean up a town, finds out that someone's been selling liquor to Indians. And he's morally outraged and kicks the Indian out of town, and he's furious because this is a threat to order and civilization. Well, Eastwood doesn't care about any of that in this movie. Instead, what he says is, this town must be really rich. This must be a good opportunity to make money. So I thought right off the bat, that was the most thing that sort of occurred to me was most interesting about this movie.
That's a great observation. I love My Darling Clementine, and I never made the connection. That's funny. A Fistful of Dollars, I saw much later. I saw in my 20s, I think, early 20s. And I had, at that point, just watched a couple of classic westerns, and it was quite shocking how different it was, right? To get back to that Leone style. How much more bloody. Obviously, as you mentioned, how the characters are self-motivated, but also he does it for his profits, but you kind of get the feeling that he kind of does it for his own amusement even. There's also that element to this film, which is, and to the 3 films, which is they're more entertaining, right? They're more trying to be entertaining in some sense than some of the classic westerns, which are very self-serious, right? This is Leone poking fun at the myth of the American West and kind of creating a new version of it. And so this is a little less mythical because, as you mentioned, it's a town western. the stakes are relatively low, but we still get that Morricone music for the final showdown, which still has that grand feeling. And one of the things, it's how bloody it is. There's a sequence in it that's, again, after seeing, I had just seen for the first time Stagecoach and My Darling Clementine, Rio Bravo, and seeing Clint Eastwood covered in blood, going under a house or something. There's a scene that's very striking this way, that looks almost like it's out of the horror film. And you really get that cultural clash. It's just a few years after Rio Bravo. You get to, with that film, you see how it was a revolution in terms of the genre, how different it was.
So my hot take on A Fistful of Dollars is in relation to Yojimbo, because, as I mentioned earlier, I rewatched the two of them almost within days of each other. So where I'm coming from at the moment is I'm thinking that possibly A Fistful of Dollars might even be a superior film to Yojimbo. They're both very good films, and they do slightly different things. It's really interesting to hear Matthew talk about how the Clint Eastwood character seems to be finding amusement in what's going on, because that's the main takeaway that I got from Yojimbo with the...
same.
Yeah, it's even stronger in Yojimbo,
Yeah, because I definitely got that in Yojimbo with the Toshiro Mifune character, that he's constantly smirking or whatever.
Yeah.
He seems to be manipulating the townspeople just for the sake of it. Whereas for me, in A Fistful of Dollars, it's more about Clint Eastwood being driven by greed. He's got that line there, there's money to be made in this town. So I just feel he's more of a greed-driven character, and you have all those close-ups of his face that he's so much more emotionless compared to Toshiro Mifune in the Kurosawa film. So for me, it's more about a greed film, and I think it makes it a slightly more interesting character. I mean, it's a bit more of a complex character in Yojimbo because he's just doing it for manipulation. But since it's all driven by greed, I guess I just find it very interesting that this is what the character basically boils down to, because the whole thing at the end of it, if you take the title into consideration, is after everything that goes down in the film, was it all really worth it for A Fistful of Dollars?
It's like the end of Fargo.
Sorry?
It's like the end of Fargo. Was it really worth it? Well, Clint Eastwood says yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
it's a good point. Yeah.
It could have been even more worth it for him as well, if you want to look at it like that. I'm not sure if we're going to spoil the film right now. Maybe we can... Actually, everyone's seen A Fistful of Dollars. Everyone who's listening to this has probably seen A Fistful of Dollars. But let's talk through the film a little bit more chronologically. Because I do actually have a similar take to Mathieu, which is that I think Eastwood's character here is really enjoying it. It's a toned-down version of Yojimbo. I mean, if we look at Yojimbo, there's the scene early on where the gangs are fighting and he's refusing to fight because they essentially double-crossed him. He's just sitting on top of a roof, laughing at them and just smirking and enjoying everything. And I don't think Fistful of Dollars took it as far, but you can see those smirks and how much he enjoys just kind of sneaking around, looking at things, watching them, learning things. And I think that out of all of these three films, this is the Eastwood character at his most mischievous. This is where he's the most playful, and also in a way at his most innocent and good. And I'm not sure if you'll disagree with this, especially you always think it's all about greed, but I think there's also a slightly more moral dimension to Eastwood's character in this film than in the others two, because it opens up with him essentially observing an injustice. So he sees, the mistreatment of the child, and then he sees mistreatment of people in the town by the other gang as well. So we start off seeing, okay, both these gangs are pretty bad. He's riding in, he notices right away both gangs are bad, both gangs are keeping this town down, and while he can make money on it, it does seem that there is a moral dimension to him just taking down a couple of bad gangs as well. And he makes some pretty moral decisions throughout the film that I'm not sure he necessarily would have made in the later two films.
Chris, it's interesting to talk about Eastwood's character's morality, because I think we've established that, money is his primary motive, but it doesn't mean that sentimental or justice is absent from his moral outlook. I actually think The Good, the Bad, the Ugly is the one where he's most moral, or at least most sentimental.
Really? Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I agree as well.
Yeah.
Well, I disagree with that. We'll keep that to when that comes, because I have the exact opposite opinion. But we'll save that one for the end.
Yes, in the first one, there is this subplot where he sort of rescues this family, the family of Marisol. I think the second one, and we can get to that, is the more interesting, because there I think there's no moral imperative for Eastwood's character, and it's all greed. And by the way, one of the most interesting things, and this is something that the Soul has mentioned several times, that the fact that these movies are about greed, is that this is more authentic to the actual history of the United States. I don't think Leone was trying to make historically accurate movies, but the history of the American West is a history of greed and exploitation. It's not a history of civilization spreading. It's a history of taking advantage of other people. So in some weird way, it's among the more it's more historically authentic than many American Westerns.
That's a very interesting point, Adam. I agree with that in terms of how the West was actually won compared to how it was put in films, how it was won, and it probably is definitely more accurate. Something which a few of my co-hosts have mentioned there about the fact that the Clint Eastwood character seems to have some good intentions at the start. I think it's more there as a deception type of thing. So it's sort of like he's set up as a good guy before Leone pulls the rug out from under our feet, and we find out that he's just motivated by greed. So he seems like this heroic character, but by the end, it all really comes down to greed for him. So for me, he's quite immoral throughout most of the film. It's all driven by greed, but not to the same extent as in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly.
Well, I actually disagree quite strongly with that. So if we can spoil, I guess, the ending decision now. At the end of the film, he literally gives back all of the money, more or less. He literally says that they can keep the money that the Rojo gang stole from the military, and that his friends that he made in the town, so the barkeep and the coffin maker, will just stay and leave the stolen money back to the military. So I think that he is trying to do the right thing in a way, which was almost a little bit surprising to me, knowing what he'll do in some of the later films.
So I think it's also a factor of Yojimbo being the original. I actually agree with Saul. I mean, though I'm absolutely sure about it, I definitely like A Fistful of Dollars more than Yojimbo. And I think you have Kurosawa is a humanist and Leone not so much. And I think that's also why you have these elements in A Fistful of Dollars, even though Yojimbo is by far Kurosawa's least humanistic film. We can get into that another day.
I was just going to mention also that yes, we might see some character change maybe at the end of A Fistful of Dollars, but the vast majority of it is him being motivated by greed, and there might be some character progression in there, but he's still starting off as a greedy character who might seem heroic on the surface, but actually, at least to begin with, is purely motivated by the profit motive.
I thought I would mention very briefly a historical episode which I became aware of, which is that when A Fistful of Dollars was released on American TV in the 1970s, the television stations added a prologue to the movie. They hired Monty Hellman, the late director of such movies like Tulane Blacktop and The Shooting, and they hired Harry Dean Stanton, and they hired a stand-in to take the appearance of Eastwood without ever showing his face. And they filmed a 4 or 5 prologue where Harry Dean Stanton is some sort of prison warden or political figure. And Eastwood's character is a prisoner. And Harry Dean Stanton offers him a pardon if he goes to this town and, cleans up the criminal element, which is exactly, the traditional plot of the town Western.
Wow.
So whatever Eastwood's character's mixed motives in A Fistful of Dollars, and I have to confess, I'm a little sympathetic to Chris's point about his ultimate morality. Whatever his motives, they were too much for American television in the 1970s. Americans handled Clint Eastwood, and they needed to make his character seem more positive. You can find this clip on YouTube, by the way. It's absolutely awful and terribly filmed.
I'll make sure to see it because I never have. So I guess because I don't think that Eastwood in this film is some kind of wonderful angel. I'm just saying I think he's at his most moral in this. I think it's also the one film he has the most human connection in. He obviously makes one actually fairly close friend in it with the barkeep, and is also relatively friendly with the coffin maker, and they help each other. And unlike later films, it's not the kind of a relationship where Eastwood will turn around and, for instance, betray them or break bonds. He'll even go through trouble to save them. So I do think that he, at this point, like you said, there's a element of taking on a degree of Kurosawa's humanism, I suppose, and also, I guess, growing pains, where the Western is moving away. It's becoming more gritty, more amoral, but it still has some of those elements left. And one of the things that were changed, on the other hand, which I think we have to mention, and which was such a big part of our discussion about The Great Silence as well, is that Eastwood's character, he shoots first, and he shoots unarmed people all the time. Like, he has no qualms about shooting an unarmed man. So I think the degree of honor that is usually presented in older Westerns, in the classic Westerns, you usually have this heroic character who will never shoot first, and even if he's going up against a criminal, will let that criminal get a chance to either shoot first or take him down in a fair duel. But Eastwood will just go into a room and start shooting, or he'll stand in the street and two of the bad guys might not have a gun and he'll still shoot them down. So I think that's a really big moral shift in how a hero acts in a Western. So, talking about these growing pains, I guess those were pretty much all gone by the next film, and we can start to see the kind of character that Eastwood will be associated with form more closely. We can see the violence tuned up. Let's just put it like this: for a few dollars more, while in so many ways it's a clear stylistic sequel down to appearance, down to glimpses, there has been a lot of progression in the development here. And like we also said, in this film, Eastwood is essentially all driven by greed. And interestingly, as these films are often seen as being about bounty hunters and how common it is for the protagonist in spaghetti westerns to be bounty hunters, this is the only one of these three films where Eastwood's character is, in fact, a bounty hunter. So I know Saul has some powerful things to say about this because it's his least favorite, and I think the only one he doesn't think is great. So let's start off with his opinion, and maybe we get a more exciting conversation and battle on our hands there.
Okay, that's great. I thought I'd end up going last for a few dollars more because I like it the least, but no, that's fine. So for a few dollars more, the best part of the film for me is Lee Van Cleef's character and performance. Absolutely dominates the screen as the other bounty hunter in the film. But look, beyond that, and the characteristic Leone traits with the rapid fire edits and the music, beyond that, I just found the pacing of it was nowhere near as intense as the other two films. It's a very leisurely paced film. It goes for over 2 hours. There's lots of scenes where there isn't a whole lot of tension building up, or there isn't the sort of like, well, I don't know how to describe, there isn't the feeling that something's about to happen, that something's about to go down. And that constantly drives the first film. And then the third film's just got such great shifting power dynamics between the characters. You're never quite sure exactly what they're going for. And you get this third film, the second film, you get it in between these two, which, was just never as involved with it as I was with the other two films.
I'm somewhat sympathetic to your viewpoint, Saul. I think at a certain point in the movie, Leone loses the pacing. And I think it's when they come to that town, Agua Caliente, where sort of the final third of the movie is set. And I think there's a certain point where the plot sort of loses steam. But I still see this movie as a slight advance over A Fistful of Dollars. Maybe not so much that I feel the need to differentiate them too much. The main difference is I feel like we have a more complex plot, whereas A Fistful of Dollars is a sort of protagonist-antagonist driven movie, with Eastwood as the protagonist and Jean Maria Volonté as the antagonist. Here we have Eastwood and Volonté back, but we add Lee Van Cleef, and we have these two protagonists. And a lot of the dramatic tension in the first half of the movie is seeing, Eastwood and Lee Van Cleef operate independently, knowing that at some point they're going to run across each other and wondering what's going to happen then. So for that alone, I find it a slightly more interesting movie.
Yeah, I guess I'm quite close to you, Adam, in that I see both as close, right? A Fistful of Dollars and For a Few Dollars More. I like both a lot. I do prefer A Fistful of Dollars. So in that sense, I agree with Saul that For a Few Dollars More is my least favorite. I think what you mentioned about the relative complexity of the plot is actually what I prefer in A Fistful of Dollars. I think the simplicity really suits at least that film very well. And part of the reason why the film kind of loses steam at one point is maybe that relative complexity of the plot. I don't know. I mean, I think it works quite well. And as you mentioned, the reason to watch this film, what makes this film work is that duo between Clint Eastwood and Lee Van Cleef. Lee Van Cleef is amazing. And it was, as I mentioned before, the first one I saw was The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And so seeing this one much later on, it was quite striking to see Lee Van Cleef play a character that's kind of sympathetic, or at least basically just as sympathetic as Clint Eastwood is. And obviously they eventually join up forces, and yeah, that's the fun of the film. I guess maybe the reason I like it a little less than A Fistful of Dollars is that epicness, that operatic quality. It's maybe a little less. Maybe it's the music. The music is a little more lighthearted. It's great also, but I think I prefer the Morricone score for A Fistful of Dollars. But yeah, to me, they're all great, really. I guess I don't differentiate that much.
Yeah, interesting. You're talking about complexity along with pacing, because during my rewatches, I think my biggest change, in my opinion, of these films was just how much For a Few Dollars More fell in my estimation, because I used to view it as this grand, epic film, almost on the scale of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And I guess in terms of scenery and variation, it does get there. And it's certainly a more complex film in terms of how many characters we have on screen. In many ways, it's a forerunner for The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly with, I would say, 3 leads, because Gian Maria Volonté in the role of Indio is in many ways a co-lead here. And each of these 3 characters get an extended, and I mean heavily extended, intro with several scenes dedicated to their backstory to set them up, just as in The Good and Bad and the Ugly. And you have this dynamic between 3 kind of protagonists that have various different relationships and power interests between them, and you don't know who is necessarily going to double cross each other. And again, you have this one duo which is very fragile, and this one other character on the outside. You don't necessarily know exactly where it will go and how it will play out. Though I guess in some ways you also do, because my main problem with this film is that it's written in 9 days and you can feel it in terms of character development. And again, this goes in with complexity. It's not that strong. Essentially, you have fairly generic tropes thrown together, but they're done incredibly well, which is the power of both Leone and Morricone. It's done spectacularly, but you just have, a fairly generic, I'm bad, I'm so bad, I'm laughing, a bad guy with Gian Maria Volante's El Indio. I mean, it's literally just giving his malicious, evil laugh whenever he can, and doing bad things. And that really leaves, just as you guys said, the core of the film and the core power of the film is to be between Clint Eastwood as Monco and Lee Van Cleef as Colonel Douglas Mortimer, where you have I agree, Van Cleef as the more sympathetic character. I mean, he is the more even-tempered and I suppose slightly more, if you will, moral. Then you have Clint Eastwood character who is a more restrained character than last time, but still this young, slightly mischievous character who is really in it for himself and out of greed, while we discover later in the film that Lee Van Cleef's character actually has some other motivation. So of course, both are bounty hunters and pretty damn effective ones. And this is one of those other big shifts from classic westerns where the bounty hunters can indeed be the heroes or the protagonists and lead the way. So yeah, I would say that's the main issue I have with the film, that it just feels underwritten. And this also affects, like you guys said, the pacing and a lot of how the film develops.
It's a good point you make, Chris, about Volonte's character. And look, I love John Maria Volonte as an actor. These are not his best roles, and I don't think it's really his fault. They're just not well-written roles. And that's perhaps one of the crowning glories of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, is it makes the villain so much more complex and so much more interesting. In these first two movies, I mean, I suppose he's entertaining enough. He's certainly loud enough, but he's a caricature, and that's something that holds back both movies a little bit.
I think Volonte is quite good, actually. He's embracing the over-the-top nature of his character. And to me, he works quite well in this film. Certainly his character is not developed, because that's not the point of this film. Even, I guess, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is the one that does the best in there. But even then, they're not they're characters. They're mythical characters again. So they're developed only to the extent that a Roman god is developed. We don't need to believe them as actual human beings, because that's not what they're here for. So I think Volonte works quite well.
Well, Mathieu, I agree. They are mythical creatures. They're not real human beings. I mean, they often don't have a backstory. And in the case of Lee Van Cleef's Mortimer, he does. But across all three movies, our villains and protagonists often don't have a narrative or thematic depth. But I feel Volonte's decision to go over the top, especially in the second movie, was a mistake. And I don't know if maybe that was something dictated to him by Leone, and if so, it's understandable. But I think there is a way to do a unrealistic character that's not just the sort of laughing hyena that we see in For a Few Dollars More.
well, actually, this is a funny trivia. It's the opposite. Leone desperately tried to get him to calm down his portrayal and minimize it to the point that he would reshoot him over and over again just to tire him out.
I feel bad now because I'm bad-mouthing an actor I actually really, really enjoy for the most part.
Me too. I love Volonte. And I think the first time, I think actually, I don't remember if I saw him for the first time in Fistful of Dollars or A Few Dollars More. In A Fistful of Dollars, it's almost forgettable because it's just part of this massive landscape almost. I mean, he's visible, but it doesn't have charisma. In this film, it does let a large part of its charisma be shown, and I think just not having experienced him in other films really made me love watching him here, because Volonte is an incredible actor. But yeah, I agree. I guess maybe that's one of the letdowns, to seeing him in so many other roles since then, and I guess I expected more, and it is undoubtedly one of his less impressive performances.
Something also that I just thought I might add, it's probably a little bit off topic at the moment, but I was just checking up the dates that I watched the films when I logged them on Letterboxd, and it looks like last year I actually watched Fistful of Dollars and For a Few Dollars More pretty much back to back, which might have not been the best way to watch them. So perhaps some of my disappointment with the second film came from after having that breathtaking experience with the first film, because definitely the whole uneasy alliance between bounty hunters definitely has a lot of rich potential in there, some of which I think is better developed in the third film, but still I'm wondering if they might have been better seen a distance apart, because I then looked how much later I saw The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and actually waited quite a few days because I was so underwhelmed by For a Few Dollars More that I almost decided not to watch the third film, because everybody was saying, well, the second film's better than the first, and I was going, no, it's not. How bad can the third one be if the second one's underwhelmed me so much? So, but yeah, look, I did make it up to the third film, which is great because it's an excellent film. But yeah, maybe if I do decide to rewatch the trilogy, maybe I should watch them with a few more days in between each, or maybe watch them out of order and see if they work better.
Yeah, I mean, as Adam mentioned, the notion of the trilogy is completely a marketing invention. I mean, they do have obviously a lot of connection with Clint Eastwood being the main actor in them, and that's basically the big reason to separate them from Once Upon a Time in the West, which is also a little less, maybe a little more of a serious film. I think that's one thing you can say for the three films that connects them together. But really, the order in which you watch them, it has no importance, of course, unless you want to see Leone's progression in that sense. But for the film themselves, not so much.
You don't think that the movies, I mean, I agree, I don't think it matters what order you watch them in, but I think there is a very subtle indication of which is how they are chronologically arranged. I think The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is the prequel, and then it goes Good, the Bad, the Ugly, A Fistful of Dollars, and then For a Few Dollars More.
Well, in terms of when they take place, literally, yes. But do you feel that Clint Eastwood's character in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly could become the character in the other two films?
Well, yeah, I mean, the big clue is that we see him acquire his costume over the course of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. We see him acquire the shirt and the sort of the sheepskin vest, and then the iconic green poncho over the course of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and then that's his costume in the next two movies.
Yeah, that's true. That's true, but in terms of character, I don't think it makes that much sense. So I never saw it that way. Yeah.
The only thing I could possibly say is you might. I mean, we go back to the morality of Eastwood's character. I'd say in The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, I feel he's at least has some sort of sentimental side to him, even if he starts off by doing very immoral things. And we see that again in A Fistful of Dollars. We see the morality of him, and then For a Few Dollars More, there's this sort of bitterly dark ending, which I suppose is maybe the climax of his character. He says he wants to retire, and he gets all this money, and so this is his happy ending: is he gets to ride off with a wagon load of corpses, is so shocking in the context of most westerns. I mean, for anything else, all three movies really show no respect for the dead. There's continued emphasis on desecration of human remains. So perhaps more morality you could see as his character's journey towards a happy retirement based on completely amoral action.
Yeah, and you mentioned a point that I might not entirely agree with, in that you said you thought that those films were perhaps more historically accurate than the classic westerns. I think in some senses they are, but in others, I do think classic westerns have some other aspects that are more historically accurate. But the disregard for the dead, I think, is very true of the old American West. I think that's actually one point that you get so desensitized in a place that is so violent. I think that's one key element that you're right is definitely present in all three films, but especially in this one and in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And that to me strikes me as something that's very true to life.
Yeah, and that brings us back to the topic of violence, which I think Chris mentioned earlier, just how incredibly violent these movies are compared to most westerns. The violence in classic westerns is unusually clean, meaning people die, but there's no blood. People get into fist fights, but no one ever gets hurt. We see that over and over again in John Wayne and John Ford movies. Well, in all three movies here, we have basically scenes of torture and scenes of massacre and scenes with copious blood. And yes, it is ultimately a more honest depiction of the West and of life.
Yeah, that question of violence is very interesting because I found myself in this situation recently because my nephew, who is he's 12, he's going to be 12 soon, and he wanted to see some westerns. But his mother said to me, we tried to watch one of the Sergio Leone, and she thought it was too violent. So she tasked me with choosing westerns for him that would be more appropriate. And so we watched Rio Bravo. And is it really more appropriate just because there's no blood? I mean, it is in some way, as you mentioned, torture is avoided. So that's good because that can be a bad thing to watch when you're too young. But yeah, I choosing Rio Bravo, it wasn't much better. Right? It's still showing violence, like Rio Bravo especially, is a film that really shows violence as a good thing, basically, that really glorifies these guys who are being violent. So, yeah, in terms of morality, it's an interesting distinction to make between the classics and the spaghettis.
It's interesting you say that, Mathieu, because, my father introduced me to the Leone Westerns, and I wasn't 12 or 13. I think it was more like 7 or 8 years old. But that's just me. My parents never restricted me from seeing any movie.
Yeah, and look at you now. You're a psychopath. So I think we know where that leads.
It's all gone wrong since then.
It's all for a few dollars more fault.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I actually buy the idea that these three characters are the same. The possibility is there. And you do make a pretty interesting case in terms of the development of the characters, where this is his ending. Riding off with all of these corpses is his happy ending, which is spectacular in so many ways. But at the same time, I do struggle to see it, because if you do look at the actions he take in GDU and in Fistful of Dollars, you do see him take more moral choices, while in For a Few Dollars More, he almost seems younger in many ways. He almost seems more shady, more in it for himself, even then, which is kind of ironic to say. But he just seems colder. Like you said, it could just be that he's burnt out. That's perfectly possible. But I still struggle to put these three characters side by side. But let's just jump straight to the good, the bad, and the ugly, and talk a little bit about them. And I do want to start with the conversation that I teased earlier just about Eastwood's character, even though it starts with these two other characters. Well, the dynamic between them is so strong. But I do want to join the topic of this being the film where Eastwood is the least moral, at least for most of the film. You could perhaps say that he earns the good by the end in a way, but this is the only film where he is an actual outlaw. He makes his money scamming people, threatening people, even killing people. This is the one film where he just kills innocent people simply for the sake of money. And it is a film where he actively betrays his partners. So I do think that in terms of morality and development, this is really the, ironically, for being the good in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, this is the point in this trilogy where the character is the most immoral, I would say.
I get what you say, Chris, and I think the reason I said differently earlier is I just thinking of that very tender scene that he had with the dying soldier near the end of the movie. And his general reaction to seeing the Civil War battle, he has this great line where he says, "I've never seen so many men wasted so badly." So I think maybe the term I should have used instead of moral was sentimental. I think he has some sentimentality in this movie. And I think the movie overall has a great deal of sentimentality that is mostly absent from the first two movies. But you make a good point about his actions beyond that, and especially considering we begin with his betrayal of Tuco. And, Tuco is not the most savory character, but it is clearly a betrayal of trust, which we don't see in his other relationships, for example, with Lee Van Cleef in For a Few Dollars More.
Yeah, you might be right, Chris. I think it's probably the contrast with Lee Van Cleef's character that makes me feel that Clint Eastwood's character is slightly more palatable, maybe more sympathetic in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly than the other two. Because Lee Van Cleef is really playing like the devil in person, and you've got Tuco, Eli Wallach, who's really the heart of the film, which, I mean, yes, that for a character like that to be the heart of the film is quite something to say, but it really does feel that way, right? He's kind of pathetic, whereas pathetic in the greater sense, right? In the sense that he inspires pity, whereas Clint Eastwood's character, he's barely human, right? He's just this demigod. And I feel that Tuco, that's maybe the big difference with The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly compared to the other two, is that Tuco is one of the main characters, and he's a character that we can empathize with, even though he is really a terrible human being.
I mean,
Let's be clear.
he might. I mean, he might be one of the worst people in the entire trilogy as well. I mean, they go over his list of crimes. We can start off like his part of his job, if you will, with the Clint Eastwood character is that he gets caught, or rather Eastwood hands him in for money, and then he frees him, usually while he's about to be hanged. So he shoots off the rope, Tuku rides off, he shoots off the hats people around so that no one can hurt him, and then they catch up and they share the money. That's pretty much their whole job. They're two hustlers and conmen. And when they read up the list of crimes that Tuco's done, I mean, I'm pretty sure there's murder on there. There's certainly rape on there. There's pretty much every single crime under the sun. And he's like the likable character, if you will. Like, he's the character that most people go away from that film as, having some kind of sentimentality for. And I think that's a pretty damn impressive job by Eli Wallach as well.
I don't think the film is soft on him. Like, I think it's pretty clear, right, that he is a bad person. It's just in the context of this opposition, he is just so much more human than the other two.
Absolutely true. He's the comic relief character, so we just instantly build up a little bit more sympathy for him, because in a way, he's the one that gets screwed over first as well. He's the one we kind of see the first injustice done to of the main characters, and he's just trying to, in a way, correct that. He's so squirmy, he's so cheeky, and it's so fun that he just steals the show in almost every single scene he's in.
I'll probably agree with Tuco being a comic relief character. In terms of whether he's sympathetic or whether the Clint Eastwood one is, I'm not sure. I guess what really drives the film for me is just the mutual distrust between the two. And they have this sort of like uneasy friendship, but it's not quite a friendship. They might both be using each other at different points, and they're never able to fully trust each other. And I sort of wonder if that's meant to be a metaphor for what it was like in the Old West and being ruthless to get ahead. But I sort of feel that neither of them, really trust each other or really feel comfortable totally with one another. And that really pulls the whole plot along, because they have to sort of rely on each other when they may or may not have certain information. And it just makes for a very fascinating and very intense ride.
Yeah, I think the relationship between Blondie or Clint Eastwood and Tuco or Eli Wallach is really one of gamesmanship, right? It's not quite a friendship, but it is playful. And generally, the spaghetti westerns in general and the Sergio Leone westerns have that playful quality, which is also another thing that they added compared to most older westerns. And that's generally a thing that was happening in the 60s, I guess, is just a much more playful approach to cinema.
Well, the reason that the Tuco character, I think, is maybe a little more sympathetic is one is that he's very funny, but the other is he has this very interesting scene with his brother in the monastery, which provides him some sort of complexity and some depth. And I think it's a touchstone of the entire movie is that this is a huge leap forward for Leone over the previous two. I think it's a much longer movie, and it's we see that it's not just a Western, but it's also a historical epic. It is explicitly tied into actual history in the way that the previous two movies were. And this one is set in, I think 1864 in the New Mexico campaign of the American Civil War. So it has that historical grounding. It has more of a narrative complexity, and it also has more character complexity in characters like Tuco. And also, I just think in the way that it dwells on suffering in a way that the first two movies don't. It dwells on the suffering, especially of the Civil War soldiers in the prison camp. We have this very heartrending scene where Tuco is being tortured, and the Union soldiers are forcing the Confederate prisoners to play music as some sort of anthem for the torture. And then we have all this scene with dying soldiers in the battle at the bridge. So sorry, I've sort of gone off on a digression, but these are all reasons that I admire this movie so greatly and so much more than the previous two, even though I very much like the previous two.
No, I definitely agree with you, Adam. I think it's also the one that really lays a vision of humanity that is, of course, a very pessimistic, well, maybe not pessimistic is the right word, but kind of misanthropic, right? Of the world is so awful and so violent, and at least it is in this moment, which is the Civil War, which is, a particularly brutal war. At the time, it was seen as unprecedented, and in some senses it was, in terms of the number of people involved in the battles and the number of deaths in very little time. And so I do think that Leone really lays this version of the world where the world is so oppressively terrible that it creates these guys, right? These three guys, the good, the bad, and the ugly, who are all affected by this incredible violence in different ways. It's just overall a grander film than the other two. I'm going to, for the last time in this podcast, say the word operatic. I'm going to stop repeating after that. But it's really, in terms of the scope of the film, the length, as you mentioned, the historical context, it's the one that really makes the most of that. It's the perfect vessel for Leone's style and Morricone's music.
Yeah, I also really love the American Civil War backdrop and how it came into it. When it originally first came up and you see the soldiers and over, I thought this is a strange plot deflection. I don't think I'm going to like this too much, but I thought it was really great, the historical background in the end, and all the tactics that you didn't realize they were using, like getting soldiers drunk to make them seem less scared. It was more of an insight into the American Civil War than I was expecting to get when I sat down to watch the film.
I also think we need to talk about how well many of those scenes are shot and just how much it affects it, because bombs going off, shooting in afar, dead soldiers everywhere. Like this is a constant motif throughout the entire film, and it is truly an epic. You even get an epic full-on battle scene at that bridge, which would have fit perfectly into almost any wartime epic. There's so many extras, there's so much going on, and it just really builds up this incredible feeling of largeness of this, again, epic film. There's other ways that the film does that are less obvious, but I really noticed this time around, including all of these small but memorable side characters, which all kind of just got their own mini setup. Obviously, you have Tuco's brother, but you have scenes like in the camp with the commander there, or with obviously the commander in the trenches. There's all of these little side characters that get one scene or two or three scenes that just feels like they're part of that film and are memorable in their own way. And there's, because of the 3-hour runtime, it really covers so much, and we get to do and see so much. It's a large part of why it is the best of the three films and why it is so memorable. It's just that it truly is just this incredible epic. I know I said that word so many times now, but it's one of the best ways of describing this film.
And I think, the epicness, I'm not sure that's a word, but the epicness of the movie is kept by this final standoff, which, I mean, it's become maybe one of the most favorite scenes in cinema history. I've certainly rewatched it so many times, that final gun battle. And this goes back to what Mathieu said about operatic. We're far beyond realism here. We have three men standing in a plaza in the middle of a cemetery. I've never heard of a plaza in the middle of a cemetery, so that itself is very awesome. And then they just stand there for 5 minutes straight and do nothing while the camera cuts frantically, and the score rises. And of course, that only follows Tuco's 5-minute run through the cemetery, which itself is just an excuse for quick cuts and more Morricone score. It's one of my favorite sequences in any movie that I've ever seen.
Yeah, it's transcendental. It exists outside of time. It's just an amazing sequence.
And it's so beautifully arranged with all these great lines that Eastwood has about, there are only two types of men in this world. All these one-liners and Tuco's insults, or just the small detail of how I love how Eastwood kills Angel Eyes and then shoots his corpse into an open grave, then shoots his hat into the open grave to join him. So it's very funny while also being very dramatic.
I think that scene and that kind of dramatic tension is one of the key components of what makes Sergio Leone such a strong director, and what makes these films stand out, because up until this point, I mean, who would shoot a 5-minute scene about people just standing around waiting to shoot? So I think it's just incredible how much tension he's able to use. And again, it's just the score and close-ups, and obviously wide-angle shots too, but just those components over and over and over again, getting closer and closer to the faces and eyes. And that's enough to really keep anyone's attention for that long when it's really just three people standing completely still.
And one of the interesting things is the scene is essentially a repeat of the ending scene in For a Few Dollars More. The only difference is it's longer and it's more complex. In For a Few Dollars More, it's 2 gunmen. Here it's 3 gunmen. And this is something that's common to the entire series, which is very unusual, which is that Leone repeats plot elements. Mm-hmm. He repeats characters. We've all seen this happen throughout movie history when someone has a successful movie and they try to make a sequel or another movie with the same cast and crew, and it always ends up bad because they're trying to rehash tired material and it all seems familiar. Leone's great achievement here is he does that. Each movie is sort of a retread of the previous movie, but it still feels fresh and exciting and new.
And the funny thing is, often the problem with sequels is they try to do the same thing but bigger, and it doesn't work. And that's exactly what he does.
Yes, it's true. That's one of the main things I was thinking about while watching these films too, especially with this ending where they're literally standing in a big circle. They're just in a circle, ending of both of these 2 films. But it really pays off. Like somehow just these components stretched out with some variation in characters, some variations in scope, each one, again, like you said, being so much bigger than the previous, and it works. And I think one of the reasons it works is the one we've been saying over and over again. And since you're not going to say it anymore, Mathieu, I'll say it for you, operatic. But it is just the fact that these films aren't really about the plot. And while you can say the good, the bad, and the ugly, in a way, it's a little bit more about the characters. You do have these large character elements. They aren't really even about the characters. Like you said, they're like gods. A large part of why they work is because they're about the style, they're about the music, they're about the shots, they're about the atmosphere and the feeling. And when that's what grounds your film and you're improving on it, then you're expanding on it. A lot of the problems when you just have a standard plot repeated over and over again just completely goes away.
You're exactly right, Chris. We spent a lot of time so far talking about characters, talking about narratives. The reason people love these movies is because of style, because of Leone's camera work, because of the music, and because I guess the characters themselves have this sort of, stylistic element to them. I mean, we ask, why do we like the man with no name? It's because he's cool. Why is he cool? Because he's sardonic, because he's good with a gun, because he has this devil-may-care attitude. And all this is underscored by the style, by the way the movies are shot. And also, in a weird way, by the production design, which we haven't mentioned yet. And I think it's kind of easy to gloss over. But it's one of the things that really stood out to me while rewatching these movies is the production design, the way the sets are designed, the way the costumes are designed, even the makeup. This is a rough and dirty Western. Everything looks kind of ramshackle. And I wonder to a certain extent, is that just the low budget of the movies, especially the first 2 movies, or if it's purposeful? I think it's a bit of both. This is a movie, all 3 movies are movies that are sort of obsessed with texture, the texture of walls, the texture of the dirt, the texture of people's faces. And that sort of adds to the whole stylistic package which Leone delivers.
I thought it was really interesting to hear you guys talk a few minutes ago about how funny the ending is and how much humor, intended or not, there is with that standoff towards the end. Because the film, of course, ends on a joke. He says, a blondie, you, and then they have the wah-wah from the music, which takes over his lines. So the whole trilogy actually ends off on a joke. So, yeah, it's just a very interesting way to wrap things up. You have that very intense first film. I guess we have the second film, which is a bit more lazily paced. And the third film, yes, it's very intense, but it actually ends off with, yes, maybe a bit of a darkly humorous standoff and a final joke with the Morricone score at the end.
And one thing I would add about the Morricone score is how innovative they are in terms of the instruments they use. Of course, it's all iconic now, so it's kind of hard to think about how new these things sound. But if you look at orchestras performing the scores from Ennio Morricone, which there are, if you go on YouTube, there's a bunch, because of course those are very popular pieces. It's kind of striking to see the strange instruments that Morricone used, and I think that's also one element You mentioned, Adam, that The Man with No Name is cool. And what makes something cool is one of the great mysteries to me of art in general, but especially cinema. And how you can reach that is just impossible to understand for me. And Morricone and Leone and Clint Eastwood are all great at it. And yeah, it's kind of a mix of innovation while also reusing elements that everyone knows. It's hard to define, really. I guess we've been talking for an hour, and I still don't really know why. In some sense, it works so well.
Well, if you're trying to make a synthesis out of this, I guess it really is all of the components we're talking about. It is the actual simplicity of these films, coupled with the shot and the music and just the atmosphere. And like you said, the essence of cool is usually just not taking yourself that seriously. And going back to one of the first things I said about this trilogy is just the way Clint Eastwood looks, the facial expressions he makes. He's not taking it that seriously. He's finding amusement in them. He's enjoying them. And just these films and these characters, especially Eastwood's characters, just being in these situations, playing with them, enjoying them, and just taking them further and further towards their extreme with all of the stylization around them. I think that's really just to try to diagnose cool. That is cool. And that is what makes this trilogy stand out over 50 years later. And I think what will make them keep standing out for 50 to 100 and maybe even hundreds of years to come, because they have this timeless quality. They've proven their timeless quality. And yeah, I think most people would say they're just pretty badass.
And this is something, they are badass. This is something, that Mathieu was mentioning earlier is how, these movies, or at least this style, has become almost synonymous with what people think Westerns are now. It's very difficult to overstate the influence of these movies. Certainly they launched a number of extraordinary careers. Clint Eastwood was a minor TV player on Rawhide before he came across these movies. By the time they were done, he was a major star, and he's gone on to 50 fantastically productive years as a cinema legend. It gave us, Sergio Leone was this minor Italian figure. Now he's this major cinema legend. He made 3 more magnificent movies, perhaps the best of their type. And then Ennio Morricone became the most acclaimed film composer in cinema history. And beyond that, the cultural influence is so wide-ranging and so profound. I mean, the entire career of Quentin Tarantino, in a certain way, is just an elaboration of spaghetti Western themes. And then beyond that, if nothing else, these movies gave us Clint Eastwood's appearance at the 2012 Republican National Convention, which was its own sort of historical atrocity, I suppose.
Not that many chairs in the Dollar Trilogy. I think that's what was missing, maybe.
So you're saying we should just remake the trilogy, or just add on a 4th film so that Clint Eastwood can finally have his shares?
Well, it's interesting is that Clint Eastwood, kind of brought the character back, didn't he? I mean, in High Plains Drifter, and I know we're getting into other territory here, but High Plains Drifter, which is one of his early directorial efforts, I think it's the 2nd movie he directed, he is once again playing a character, a man with no name, and it is once again a very dark and humorous Western. And then again in Pale Rider, which is really a Shane remake, he again plays a character who has no name. So in some ways, he carried on the legacy.
Yeah, and then in Unforgiven, he buried it, I think. I mean,
that was the thematic idea, yeah, or the metaphorical idea. And the one thing we didn't mention is that Sergio Leone actually broke up his deal with the producers of A Fistful of Dollars, which is why he made for a few dollars more with a new character. And they got sued, and they lost. The producers lost, because even though Eastwood is wearing the same clothes, the court found that this type of character was just public domain. And I suppose this works in Eastwood's favor as well. I mean, he could keep playing similar characters in Westerns and just carry on that tradition in his own way. And of course, Sergio Leone, even though he didn't make that many more films, he carried on the tradition as well, leading, of course, to Once Upon a Time in the West, which I think most of us agree is even stronger than The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. So I think that...
No. I don't agree with that. Not at all.
That's fine. That's
it's
fine.
great. It's great, but I prefer
Well,
The Good, the Bad, and
that's
the
going to be the podcast sequel, right? We'll have
yes.
to do Once Upon a Time in the West.
Let's do it. Yeah, it's good. So we can do the Once Upon a Time trilogy, which is even more diverse, shall we say, going from this kind of action comedy style of Duck You Sucker / A Fistful of Dynamite, and then on to Once Upon a Time in America, which is not even a Western. So if you guys are up for that, we can schedule that in for the future.
Yeah, and Duck You Sucker is named Once Upon a Time in the Revolution in France, so it does fit in that imaginary trilogy.
Exactly. So yeah, that's plan. Now we're gonna do it. So thank you all for listening, and join us again soon. You have been listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.